The morning Hazel found the man in the shipping container, she almost didn't stop. It was the kind of February cold that settles into your bones before you even realize it's there. The kind that turns your breath white and makes the frozen gravel of the salvage yard crunch like broken glass underfoot. Hazel was 11 years old and small for her age, wearing a coat that had been her grandmother's before it was hers, the sleeves rolled up 3 times at the wrist. She came to the yard every Saturday morning to collect whatever copper wire or aluminum cans she could find before the older scrappers arrived, and pick the good spots clean. Her grandmother, Bess, had bad knees and couldn't make the walk anymore. Hazel could. So she did. She was cutting between 2 rows of crushed sedans when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost convinced herself it was the wind finding a gap in the corrugated metal fences. But then it came again. A low, deliberate knocking. 3 slow beats. A pause, 3 more. Hazel stopped walking. The container was an old sea freight unit pushed against the back fence, half hidden under a rusted tarp that someone had thrown over it years ago. The kind of thing you walked past so many times it stopped registering as anything, but the knocking was coming from inside it. She was certain of that now. She looked around. The yard was empty this early. The office wouldn't open for another 40 minutes. Any reasonable person would have left. Walked to the gas station on Birchwood and called someone from the payphone. Any reasonable person would have been afraid. Hazel pulled the tarp back and found the latch. The container door swung open with a sound like a held breath releasing, and in the gray morning light she saw him, a man in a wool overcoat that had once been expensive, both wrists bound behind him with zip ties, a strip of tape across his mouth. There was dried blood above his left eyebrow, and his lips were cracked from cold. He was shaking, but his eyes, when they found her face, were absolutely alert. He was alive. Hazel didn't scream. She didn't run. She climbed up into that container and started working at the tape on his mouth with careful fingers, the way her grandmother had taught her to do things. Slowly, so you don't make anything worse. "Hello," he said when his mouth was free. His voice came out like gravel. "Hello," Hazel said back. "I'm going to find something for your hands." His name was Edmund Waverley. She wouldn't learn that for another hour. What Hazel did learn, in the weeks that followed, was that Edmund Waverley was the kind of name that made bank tellers stand up straighter and restaurant managers appear from the back. He was 61 years old, a widower, and the founder of Waverley Northern, a construction and development company with projects in 4 provinces. His photograph had been on the business section of the Vancouver Sun 3 times in the last decade. He owned a house in West Vancouver with a view of the inlet and a place near Whistler he visited every January. He had been missing for 11 days when Hazel found him. She didn't know any of that when she ran to the salvage yard office and hammered on the door until the night watchman, barely awake, let her use the phone. She didn't know it when the ambulance came, or when the 2 RCMP officers arrived and started asking her questions. She answered as carefully and completely as she could, because Bess had always told her the truth was the shortest distance between 2 points. She knew only that there had been a man in the container, and he was cold, and she had found him. Edmund was taken to Vancouver General. Hazel gave her statement, gave her grandmother's address when they asked, and then walked the 40-minute route home because she had missed the bus. Bess was at the kitchen table with her morning tea when Hazel came in. "You're late," Bess said, and then, looking at her granddaughter's face more carefully, "Sit down and tell me." Hazel sat down and told her. Bess listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was how she listened to everything important. When Hazel finished, Bess set down her mug and was quiet for a moment. "You did right," she said. "You kept your head." That was all she said, but the way she said it made Hazel feel, for a moment, like the warmest she had been all morning. They lived in East Vancouver, Bess and Hazel, in the bottom half of a duplex on a street where the maples were so old they'd buckled the sidewalk. The rent was manageable because the pipes knocked in winter and the upstairs neighbor worked night shifts and came home at 4 in the morning. Bess had lived there for 22 years, first with Hazel's grandfather until he passed, then with Hazel's mother until she left, and now with Hazel, who had come to her at age 4 with a backpack containing 1 change of clothes and a stuffed rabbit with a missing eye. Bess never talked about Hazel's mother in a way that made Hazel feel like something was broken. She talked about her the way you talk about weather, something that happened, something that changed things, Something you adjusted to. Your mother has a hard time, she would say, if Hazel asked. That doesn't mean you're not loved. It just means the love got tangled up in something bigger than she could manage. Hazel had thought about that sentence a lot over the years. She still wasn't entirely sure she understood it, but she trusted that Bess meant it kindly, and that was enough. They were not poor in the dramatic way that stories sometimes described. There was food on the table. There were library books. There was warmth. But there was also careful math at the grocery store, and Hazel knew which brands were the ones Bess actually wanted, and which were the ones they could afford, and she had learned to tell the difference. She collected scrap on Saturday mornings. She didn't complain about the coat with the rolled-up sleeves. 3 days after the salvage yard, a woman called from a number Hazel didn't recognize. She said she was Edmund Waverley's assistant and that Mr. Waverley wanted to express his gratitude in person if Hazel and her grandmother were willing to visit him at the hospital. Bess held the phone for a long moment after the call ended. "We don't have to go," she said. "I'd like to," Hazel said. "I want to know if he's all right." Bess looked at her granddaughter, this small, serious child who had climbed into a dark container in a February salvage yard without hesitating, and nodded once. "Then we'll go," she said. Edmund Waverley, in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm and 3 days of proper sleep behind him, looked considerably better than he had in the container, but still not entirely like a person who usually appeared in business sections. There were shadows under his eyes that sleep hadn't reached yet, and his left hand shook slightly when he reached out to shake Bess's hand. "Thank you for coming," he said, and then to Hazel, "Thank you for finding me." Hazel sat in the chair beside his bed and looked at him with the direct, evaluating look that children sometimes have when they haven't yet learned it makes adults uncomfortable. "Who put you in there?" she asked. Edmund blinked. His assistant, standing near the door, made a small sound. "Hazel," Bess said. "It's all right," Edmund said. He looked at Hazel for a moment, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "People who work for me," he said. "Or people who used to work for me. It's being sorted out. Were you scared?" A pause. "Yes." Hazel nodded, as if that settled something. "You knocked 3 times, she said. "That's why I stopped. It sounded like you were doing it on purpose." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "I was," he said. "I'd been doing it for days. I'd almost stopped." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite grief, but lived near it. He looked at Hazel, sitting there in her grandmother's coat, this child who had been dragging a metal cart through a salvage yard at 7 in the morning, and his expression shifted into something Hazel couldn't fully read. "I have a daughter," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "I had a daughter. She would have been about your age." The room was very quiet. "She died," he said. 6 years ago. A car accident." He looked at his hands. "I was driving." No one said anything. Bess, who understood that some silences were not meant to be filled, simply sat with her hands folded. "I'm sorry," Hazel said, because she was. Edmund looked up. "I am too," he said every day. He didn't say more about it, but something in the way he'd looked at Hazel, that particular stillness, stayed with her on the bus ride home. Edmund was discharged the following week. 3 men who had managed his accounts receivable were arrested in connection with his kidnapping. The story ran in the paper for 2 days, and then moved aside for other things, the way news does. 2 weeks after that, a package arrived at the duplex on the maple-lined street. Inside was a card with Edmund Waverley's name printed on it, and a check made out to Bess with more zeros than Hazel had ever seen associated with their address. There was a note in his handwriting. "For whatever it's needed for, no obligation attached to this. You raised her well." Bess sat at the kitchen table with the check in her hands for a long time. "We're not cashing this," Hazel said from across the table. Bess looked at her. "Why not?" Hazel thought about it. "It feels like it changes what I did. Like I did it for something." Bess was quiet. Then she said, "When someone gives you something because you were kind, that doesn't change the kindness. It just means the kindness rippled. But we didn't do it for ripples." "No," Bess agreed. "But they happen anyway. They sent Edmund a letter." Bess wrote it, but Hazel read it over and added one line at the bottom in her own handwriting. "I would have stopped anyway. I hope you know that." Edmund called the following Thursday evening. Bess answered, and they spoke for a few minutes, and then she handed the phone to Hazel with an expression that was careful and warm at the same time. "I got your letter," Edmund said. "Bess wrote most of it," Hazel said. "I know. But I also got your line." A pause. I do know that. I think I knew it when I saw you. Hazel didn't say anything. I'd like to, if it would be all right with your grandmother. I'd like to be in touch. I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. I just think. He stopped. Started differently. I've been in a lot of rooms this past month. Hospital rooms, police stations, boardrooms. Everyone in every one of those rooms wanted something from me or for me. You just wanted to know if I was okay. You were cold, Hazel said simply. Yes, Edmund said. I was. Bess, standing in the kitchen doorway, watched her granddaughter hold the phone with both hands and talk to a man she had pulled out of a shipping container, like it was the most natural conversation in the world. Something in Bess's chest loosened just slightly, in the way that things do when you realize the person you've been raising will probably be all right. It was Bess who noticed first the way Edmund looked at Hazel. Not in any way that troubled her. It wasn't that. It was something else. A searching quality, a care that seemed to go deeper than gratitude. He had started coming to the neighborhood on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to have coffee with Bess, who was sharp enough company that Bess suspected he genuinely enjoyed it. But he always brought Hazel something, not expensive, never trying to impress. A book about cartography because she had mentioned maps once, a seed packet of tomatoes because she had said she liked growing things, but their balcony got too much shade. Small, noticing things. Bess had spent 67 years learning to read people. She read Edmund Waverley carefully and found in him a man being careful not to take up too much space, which was unusual in men who were used to occupying large ones. She found grief that hadn't finished moving through him. She found loneliness of a very specific kind, the kind that isn't about company, but about the absence of a particular person. She also found that Hazel, who was not typically a child who warmed to adults quickly, had begun watching for his car on Saturday mornings. The thing Bess had not yet said aloud. The thought she turned over at night like a stone she wasn't sure she wanted to look under. Began the afternoon, Edmund brought a photograph to show Hazel. It was from a news archive, a picture of a waterway project his company had completed near Kelowna. But in his wallet, she saw another photograph, just a glimpse. A small girl, dark-haired, serious-faced. The age was wrong. The coloring was similar enough to make the breath catch. Bess had spent years not letting herself think about Hazel's father. Her daughter had been 19 and in no condition to name anyone, and Bess had decided the most useful thing she could do was raise the child in front of her without building her identity around an absence. But the question had never entirely gone away. She didn't say anything. Not then. It was Hazel herself who brought it up, in the way that children sometimes do. Sideways, quietly, without fully knowing what they're asking. They were at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Edmund was telling a story about a project in northern BC, about a supply route that had gotten snowed in, and how his crew had had to improvise with what they had. Hazel was listening with her chin in her hand, and then, out of nowhere, she said, I dreamed about a lake last week. A specific one. I've never been to a lake, but I knew what it looked like. Edmund stopped talking. What did it look like, he said, and his voice was very even, very careful, in the way of someone keeping it that way on purpose. Big, Hazel said, with birch trees right down to the edge, and a red dock that was old and kind of rotting. There was a yellow boat tied to it. She frowned slightly. It felt like somewhere I'd been. The color had left Edmund's face. Bess looked at him. Okanagan, he said barely. There was a property. Before, when my daughter was very small, we had a red dock and a yellow rowboat. His voice was not quite steady. We called it the butterboat. Because my daughter thought it was the color of butter. The name had come out before he caught it. Hazel looked at him with her serious, evaluating look. Charlotte, she said, why did you stop saying it? Edmund pressed his hand flat against the table. Bess could see him making the calculation, the hope that had been growing in him that he had been trying not to name because naming hopes made them dangerous. My daughter's name was Charlotte, he said. She was 5 when she died. Or when I believed she died. He looked at Hazel, and his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at a very long drop. But they never found her. I've always told myself that was because of how cold the water was, because of the current. He stopped. I never let myself think anything else. Because I couldn't, if I let myself hope and I was wrong. Edmund, Bess said quietly. He looked at her. I never knew the name of Hazel's father, she said. My daughter wouldn't tell me. But I know where she was that summer, 19 years ago. She paused. She was working a season near Penticton. The kitchen was absolutely still. Hazel looked at her grandmother and then at Edmund and then back at her grandmother again, with the look of someone assembling something in their mind by piece that they had always known was missing a shape. "Bess," she said, "are you telling me something?" "I'm telling you," Bess said carefully, "that questions deserve answers, and that some answers have been waiting longer than they had any right to." The DNA test was Edmund's idea, and he raised it with a gentleness that surprised Bess. He didn't push, didn't plead, just asked if they would be willing and said that whatever the result was, it changed nothing about how he felt. He'd already told his solicitor to begin setting up an education fund for Hazel regardless. This wasn't about an outcome, he just needed to know. Hazel agreed without ceremony. "Of course," she said, "obviously." The results took 9 days. Edmund was sitting in his car outside the duplex when Bess called him. It was raining, a soft Vancouver rain that made the maple leaves darken and the street smell of wet earth. He had told himself he would handle either answer. He had spent 9 days preparing for either answer. He answered the phone on the first ring. Bess didn't say the result immediately. She said, "She's here if you want to come in," and Edmund understood from that sentence alone that there was news to come in for. He was at the door in 3 minutes. Hazel opened it before he knocked. She had clearly been standing near it. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the rain-colored light. "So," Hazel said with the careful matter-of-factness of someone who has decided to be brave, "I guess you're my dad." Edmund's face did something complex and private, and then settled into something that had been absent from it for 6 years. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the relief of a weight that had been carried so long the person carrying it had forgotten it was there. "I guess I am," he said. They didn't rush anything. That was the thing that people, later, would sometimes get wrong when Bess told the story. They assumed that the revelation changed everything overnight, that Hazel moved into the house in West Vancouver and Edmund stepped into a father role fully formed and everyone adjusted seamlessly. It wasn't like that. It was slower and more careful and more honest than that. Hazel stayed in the duplex on the maple-lined street. Because it was home, and because Bess was home, and because Edmund understood without being told that home was not something you uprooted just because the circumstances had changed. He came for dinner on Thursdays. Hazel visited Whistler for a weekend in March and told Edmund with characteristic frankness that she found it very quiet and also kind of too many pillows. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, in a way that Bess, watching from the kitchen doorway, recognized as the laugh of someone who hadn't laughed like that in a very long time. There were hard conversations. There were evenings when Hazel went quiet in a way that meant she was processing something large, and Bess let her process it, and Edmund learned to let her process it too, which was not an easy thing for a man accustomed to solving problems quickly. There was a night Hazel asked him what her mother had been like, meaning the mother she'd never known, meaning her biological mother, his daughter's mother, and Edmund told her honestly, young and funny and not ready. "She wasn't a bad person," he said. "She was just at the beginning of herself. Not everyone's ready to be a parent when a child arrives." Hazel thought about that, and then she said, "Bess says something like that about my mom too. Maybe it's just true of some people," Edmund said. "Maybe," Hazel said, and then after a moment, "I'm glad you were ready now." Edmund was quiet for a long time. "I'm glad you found me," he said. "I'm glad you stopped." Hazel shrugged, but there was a softness in it. "You knocked 3 times, she said. "On purpose." "Yes," he said. "Then I was always going to stop," she said. Outside, the February cold had become March, and the maples were beginning their slow, stubborn return to green. Bess made tea in the kitchen and listened to her granddaughter. Her daughter, in every way that mattered, talked to the man who had been looking for her for 6 years without knowing where to look. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she held her mug with both hands and felt, in the bones that had carried this child for 7 years, something settle that had never quite settled before. Some stories, Bess had learned, did not end. They arrived. They found the people they belonged to, and they arrived, and then the real living could begin.